Before we start, I ask you to subscribe. Tell us where you're from and don't forget to leave a like. The day we arrived at Whispering Pines Trailer Park, something felt wrong. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but there was an unnatural stillness in the air that made my skin crawl. My husband Diego said I was just being paranoid. After all, moving from bustling Los Angeles to rural Oregon was bound to feel strange. But I, Marta Martinez, had learned to trust my instincts over the years, and everything about this place screamed danger. The first sign came when we were parking our trailer. As the sun began its descent behind the towering Douglas firs, I noticed how our trailer's shadow seemed to stretch impossibly long across the gravel path. It wasn't just an ordinary elongation that comes with the setting sun. The edges appeared to ripple and writhe like tentacles testing the air. I blinked hard, convinced my exhausted mind was playing tricks on me, but when I looked again, the shadow had settled into normalcy. Our neighbors were few and far between, their trailers scattered throughout the sprawling park like forgotten toys, most kept to themselves, only emerging at odd hours to scurry between their homes and their cars. There was one exception, an elderly woman named Mrs. Blackwood, who lived in a vintage Airstream at the park's edge the moment she saw us arriving. She watched from her window with an intensity that made me uncomfortable, her gnarled fingers pressed against the glass. That night, as Diego and our children slept soundly, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The moonlight filtered through our windows, casting strange patterns on our walls. But it was the shadows beneath our trailer that kept drawing my attention. They seemed deeper than they should be, darker than natural darkness, if such a thing was possible. And sometimes, when I stared long enough, I could swear I saw them pulse with a life of their own, 2 days after we moved in. I met Tom Hansen, the park manager. He was a thin man with hollow eyes who spoke in whispers, as if afraid of being overheard by something lurking nearby. When I asked about the previous tenants of our lot, his face drained of color. "They moved on," he muttered, refusing to meet my gaze. "People don't tend to stay long at Whispering Pines." Before I could press further, he hurried away, leaving me with more questions than answers. The breaking point came on our 5th night. I was awakened by a sound I'll never forget. A wet, sliding noise, like something massive dragging itself across damp ground. Through our bedroom window, I watched in horror as dark tendrils emerged from beneath Mr. Peterson's trailer across the way. They moved with terrible purpose, wrapping around his home like hungry fingers. The next morning, Mr. Peterson's trailer stood empty, with no sign of struggle or forced entry. When I asked the other residents about him, they simply turned away, their faces masks of carefully crafted ignorance. The disappearance of Mr. Peterson was only the beginning. Over the next few days, I started documenting everything strange I witnessed at Whispering Pines. My digital camera became my constant companion, though every photo I took of the shadows came out distorted, showing impossible geometries that hurt my eyes to look at. Diego thought I was becoming obsessed, but he hadn't seen what I had seen. He couldn't understand why I kept our children, Maya and Luis, inside after sunset. Mrs. Blackwood finally approached me one rainy afternoon, her arthritis-twisted hands clutching a leather-bound journal so old the pages had turned yellow. "You see them too, don't you?" she whispered, pressing the book into my hands. "I've been watching you, Marta. You're like me. You can sense what's wrong here." The journal, she explained, belonged to a woman named Elizabeth Crawford who lived in the park in 1967. As I read through the entries that night, my blood ran cold. Elizabeth had documented similar disappearances, along with detailed sketches of writhing shadows that matched exactly what I'd been seeing. The most disturbing revelation came from Elizabeth's final entry, dated October 31st, 1967. She described discovering ancient symbols carved into the ground beneath every trailer pad, hidden by years of gravel and dirt. According to her research, the symbols were part of a containment pattern designed to keep something imprisoned. But the pattern was breaking down, and whatever was trapped below was finding ways to reach through the weakening barriers. Elizabeth disappeared the night after writing that entry. I couldn't sleep after reading the journal. So I decided to investigate. Armed with a flashlight and a shovel, I started digging beneath our trailer at midnight. 3 feet down, I found it, a symbol carved into the bedrock, its lines filled with a black substance that seemed to absorb my flashlight's beam. As I brushed dirt from the marking, the ground beneath my feet began to tremble, and I heard whispers in a language that no human throat could produce. That's when I noticed them, dozens of shadows beginning to converge around me, moving against the light of my flashlight. They weren't just coming from our trailer anymore, but seeping out from every dark space in the park. The whispers grew louder, and in their alien syllables, I began to understand fragments of meaning. They spoke of hunger, of freedom, of 1,000 years of imprisonment coming to an end. I scrambled out of the hole, but not before one of the shadows brushed against my ankle, leaving a burn mark that throbbed with an otherworldly cold. Running back inside, I found Mrs. Blackwood waiting in our kitchen, her face grave. "Now you know," she said, rolling up her sleeves to reveal arms covered in similar burn marks. "But knowing isn't enough. They're getting stronger, Marta. The barrier is failing, and when it does..." She didn't finish her sentence, but she didn't need to. The growing shadows visible through our windows spoke volumes about what would happen when whatever was imprisoned beneath whispering pines finally broke free. I never meant to witness the actual moment someone was taken. It happened 3 nights after my discovery of the symbols. When my neighbor Janet Morris stepped out to walk her dog, I was at my window, documenting shadow movements as I'd been doing every night, when the darkness beneath her trailer suddenly surged upward like a geyser of black ink. Her scream lasted only seconds before being cut off, not by silence, but by a sound like wet leather being stretched to its breaking point. Her dog's leash clattered to the ground, empty. The shadows retreated, taking both Janet and her terrier with them, leaving nothing behind but twin burn marks on the gravel. Mrs. Blackwood's research materials proved invaluable as I delved deeper into the park's history. Hidden in the back of Elizabeth's journal, I found newspaper clippings dating back to 1932, when Whispering Pines was first established. The park's founder, Augustus Pine, was described as an eccentric occultist who claimed to have discovered doorways to realms beyond human comprehension. What caught my attention was a photograph showing Augustus standing in front of a strange stone altar, now buried beneath the park's central office building. During my late-night research sessions, I discovered that Augustus Pine hadn't acted alone. He was part of a secret society called the Keepers of the Void, who believed they could harness interdimensional energy for their own power. The trailer park's layout wasn't random. Each pad was positioned precisely to create a massive binding circle. The symbols I'd found weren't meant to imprison the entities, they were designed to channel their energy. But something had gone wrong, and now the channels were becoming two-way streets. The truth hit me like a physical blow when I correlated the dates of disappearances with lunar cycles. They weren't random at all. They were sacrifices, meant to maintain the barrier between our world and theirs. Every time someone was taken, the rest of the park would be safe for another week. It was a horrible equation of human arithmetic, and we were all potential variables. I found lists of names going back decades, each marked with a date and a simple notation, contributed to the balance. That night, my daughter Maya woke up screaming about the black hands reaching through her bedroom floor. When I rushed to her room, I saw them, dozens of shadow tendrils probing upward through seemingly solid floorboards. I grabbed Maya and ran, but not before catching a glimpse through the gaps in the floor. Below our trailer wasn't earth or foundation, but a writhing mass of darkness that seemed to stretch down forever. In that moment, I understood we weren't living above a prison for these entities. We were living on top of their feeding ground. Diego finally believed me when he saw the burn marks appearing on Maya's ankles. Identical to mine, Mrs. Blackwood explained that once the shadows marked you, they would keep coming back, drawn to the essence they'd tasted. We were running out of time. The marks were spreading up our legs like dark vines, and with each passing hour, the whispers in that alien language grew clearer. They were telling us about a place beyond the shadows, a dimension of eternal torment where time had no meaning and pain was the only reality. And soon, they promised we would all see it firsthand. Mrs. Blackwood's deteriorating condition forced her to reveal the darkest secrets of Whispering Pines. As the burn marks consumed more of her body, she told me everything from her hospital bed. The park wasn't just built on a portal. It was a machine designed to harvest human suffering. Each trailer pad was strategically placed over what she called hunger points, where the barrier between dimensions was thinnest. The Keepers of the Void hadn't been trying to contain the entities. They'd been feeding them systematically. I spent hours in the local library's restricted archives, piecing together the truth. Augustus Pine's documents revealed that the entities fed on human agony, but not just any suffering would do. It had to be the specific kind of terror that comes from betrayal. The Keepers would invite families to live in the park, making them feel safe and welcome, only to sacrifice them at precise lunar intervals. The Shadows weren't randomly choosing their victims. They were following a carefully orchestrated schedule that had been in place for nearly a century. The true horror of our situation became clear when I found Augustus Pine's original blueprints hidden behind a false wall in the park office. The trailer pads formed more than just a containment circle. They created a massive sigil of binding, written in the geometry of human despair. Each family's terror and betrayal strengthened the pattern, but it required constant renewal. The entities weren't trying to break free, they were being invited in, one sacrifice at a time, to prevent them from taking everyone at once. Diego and I tried to warn the remaining residents, but most were already too deeply ensnared. The Shadows had marked almost everyone in the park, and those marks were more than just burns. They were claims of ownership. Through Mrs. Blackwood's grimoire, I learned that the marks formed a sort of mystical contract. Once marked, a person could be taken at any time. Their suffering used to feed the endless hunger below. Our own marks were spreading faster now, turning our skin into a map of the entity's growing power. That night, during a new moon, we witnessed the park manager Tom Hansen performing the ritual we'd read about in Pine's journals. In the central office, he knelt before that buried altar, now exposed, chanting in that same alien language we'd been hearing in the whispers. The Shadows responded to his call, coalescing into forms that defied sanity. I watched in horror as he offered his own blood, letting it drip into the carved channels of the altar. The Shadows drank it eagerly, and with each drop, the marks on our bodies burned colder. Through the grimoire, I finally understood what was coming. The rituals had been maintaining a delicate balance, feeding the entities just enough to keep them from fully manifesting in our world. But someone had disrupted the pattern, possibly intentionally. The next sacrifice wouldn't just feed them. It would transform Whispering Pines into a permanent gateway between dimensions. And according to the lunar calendar and the pattern of marks on our skin, my family was scheduled to be that final sacrifice. The final night at Whispering Pines arrived with an unnatural darkness that devoured even the stars. Our burn marks had spread to cover most of our bodies, and through them, we could feel the entity's anticipation, a horrible, hungry excitement that made our marked skin ripple with alien movements. Maya hadn't stopped crying for hours, and Luis had fallen into a trance-like state, mumbling coordinates in that ancient language. We were running out of time, but Mrs. Blackwood's last message had given me hope. The pattern can be broken, but only through willing sacrifice. In Augustus Pine's final journal entry, I found what I needed. The entities required betrayal to feed, but they could be bound by an act of willing sacrifice. Someone choosing to enter their realm, not through force or manipulation, but through pure intention. The catch was devastating. The sacrifice had to be both willing and unexpected. The person performing it couldn't know they were the sacrifice until the moment of truth. This revelation hit me like a physical blow as I realized why Mrs. Blackwood had shared so much with me. She wasn't just preparing me for what was coming. She was setting me up to be the perfect sacrifice. The park's transformation had begun. The Shadows weren't just moving anymore. They were reshaping reality itself. Trailers twisted into impossible shapes, their metal and wood flowing like liquid in the darkness. The ground beneath our feet became transparent at times, revealing glimpses of that infinite void where the entities dwelled. Through the windows of every trailer, we could see our neighbors floating in that darkness, their faces frozen in eternal screams as the entities fed on their endless terror. Diego worked with me to set up the counter ritual, not knowing I had altered the protective circles he drew. My heart shattered as I watched him place Maya and Luis in the center of what he thought was the strongest barrier. The shadows converged around us as I began the chant, my marked skin burning with each syllable. At the critical moment when the portal began to open beneath the central office, I broke the circle. Not the one around my family, but the one around myself. The entities surged forward, expecting to claim all of us, but met an unexpected truth. A mother's willing sacrifice, offered with full knowledge and acceptance. The paradox of a sacrifice that was both knowing and unexpected shattered their ritual. My consciousness exploded into fragments as the shadows took me, but not in the way they wanted. Instead of feeding on my terror, they were forced to consume my love, my determination, my willing acceptance of the void. The last thing I saw was Diego's face, illuminated by the collapsing portal. As he realized what I'd done, the shadows that had marked us began to burn away, taking with them the ancient bindings that had held Whispering Pines in their grip for so long. As I fell into that infinite darkness, I felt the entity's hunger turn to confusion, then to something like fear. They had fed on betrayal for so long that they didn't know how to process a willing sacrifice. My consciousness scattered across their dimension, becoming a poison to their very existence. In the end, Whispering Pines returned to being just another trailer park in Oregon. The marks faded from my family's skin, and the shadows beneath the trailers went back to being just shadows. Diego and the children moved away, carrying the truth with them, sometimes on very dark nights. They say you can still hear whispers in that alien language, but now they're whispers of warning, of telling other entities to stay away from the place where shadow hunger met sacrificial love and lost. I've always found solace in the static. There's something comforting about being alone in my trailer, surrounded by the vast wilderness of the Adirondacks, listening to distant voices crackling through my radio equipment. Tonight, however, as the snow piles up outside my windows and the wind howls through the mountain peaks, something feels different. The atmospheric interference is creating unusual patterns in the frequencies I usually monitor. The copper taste of my last coffee still lingers on my tongue as I adjust the dials, trying to clean up a peculiar signal that keeps bleeding through multiple bands. It's unlike anything I've encountered in my 15 years as a ham radio operator. The sound reminds me of whale songs played backwards, overlaid with what could be human voices speaking in tongues. I should know better than to leave it playing, but curiosity has always been my weakness. My logbook sits open beside me, its pages filled with countless frequencies and timestamps from previous sessions. As I note down this new anomaly, my hand trembles slightly. The temperature in the trailer seems to have dropped, though my thermostat shows no change. The signal grows stronger, and with it comes a subtle vibration that I feel more in my teeth than in my ears. Something about it makes my skin crawl, but I can't bring myself to turn it off. The digital clock on my equipment rack shows 3:33 a.m. when the first coherent words emerge from the chaos. They're whispered in a voice that sounds like dry leaves scraping against concrete. "The silence must be sown," the phrase repeats, gaining clarity with each iteration, until it's joined by other voices, all chanting in perfect unison. My recording equipment is running, capturing every second of this transmission, though part of me wishes it wasn't. I notice my reflection in the darkened window, my face illuminated by the soft glow of radio dials. For a moment, I could swear I see something moving behind me, like threads of silver dancing in the air. When I turn around, there's nothing there, but my lips begin to tingle with a sensation I've never felt before. It's as if invisible needles are gently pricking the skin around my mouth. The compulsion to keep listening grows stronger as the signal modulates into a low, pulsing hum. I reach for my notebook to document the changing frequency patterns, but my hand freezes halfway. There, on the open page, I find drawings I don't remember making. Crude sketches of faces with their lips drawn together by intricate stitching patterns. The most disturbing part isn't the drawings themselves, but the fact that they're written in what appears to be my own handwriting. My hands won't stop shaking as I drive through the snowy darkness toward the local library. It's been 3 days since that first transmission, and I haven't slept more than a few hours. The signal keeps returning each night at exactly 3:33 a.m., and with it comes that maddening urge to thread something through my lips. I've covered all the mirrors in my trailer. I can't bear to look at my reflection anymore, afraid I'll see those silver threads again. The library is empty, except for Mrs. Henderson, the elderly head librarian who's known me since I first moved to these mountains. As I approach her desk, she gasps, her hand flying to her mouth. "Marcus, your lips," she whispers. I touch them self-consciously, but feel nothing unusual. When I ask her what she means, she just shakes her head and looks away. I notice her hands trembling as she types something into her ancient computer. The microfiche archives reveal a pattern I wish I hadn't found. Every 27 years, there are reports of mass hysteria in the Adirondacks. People claiming to hear strange radio frequencies, followed by incidents of self-mutilation. The most recent case was in 1996, when an entire hunting lodge was found abandoned. The only clue was a journal containing endless repetitions of the phrase, "The silence must be sown," written in different handwriting styles. Deep in the newspaper archives, I find an article from 1969 about a religious sect called the Whispering Circle. They believed in an ancient entity that fed on human voices, and their rituals involved elaborate ceremonies of voluntary silencing. The photographs show their compound near Echo Lake, just a few miles from where my trailer is parked. My blood runs cold when I recognize the complex geometric patterns carved into their altar stones. They're identical to the interference patterns I've been recording. Mrs. Henderson appears behind me with a stack of books she claims might help. But as she sets them down, I notice something horrifying. Tiny droplets of blood spotting the pages as she speaks, seeping from what appear to be invisible puncture wounds around her mouth. She seems completely unaware of it. When I try to point it out, the words stick in my throat, replaced by that same humming frequency I've been hearing on my radio. I grab the most relevant books and hurry back to my trailer as the sun sets. But as I drive through the deepening darkness, I realize I'm not alone on these mountain roads. Other cars are heading in the same direction, all converging on Echo Lake. Behind each windshield, I glimpse faces illuminated by dashboard lights, their mouths moving in perfect synchronization with the static that's now playing through my truck's radio, though I never turned it on. The books from the library lay scattered across my trailer floor, their pages marked with fluorescent sticky notes. I've been awake for 36 hours straight, fueled by black coffee and growing dread. The history of the Whispering Circle is more disturbing than I initially thought. They weren't just a cult, they were guardians, keeping something ancient contained through their rituals of silence. The more I read, the more I understand why they chose these mountains. My radio equipment hasn't stopped picking up frequencies, even when powered down. The signals are getting stronger, bleeding into every electronic device I own. My phone plays the humming through its speakers. My laptop emits the chanting even when muted. And last night, my digital watch started whispering the words I've grown to dread. The silence must be sown. The silence must be sown. The silence must be sown. Until I smashed it against the wall, the morning news confirms my worst fears. 3 teenagers were found in the Echo Lake parking lot, their mouths sealed shut with invisible stitches that doctors can't remove. The medical reports describe wounds appearing from nowhere, threading patterns that materialize and disappear under different types of light. I recognize the geometric patterns they're forming. They match the diagrams in the cult's ritual books. But it's not just at Echo Lake anymore. Similar cases are being reported across the Adirondacks. I drive to the old cult compound, my truck's radio now a symphony of overlapping chants and whispers. The abandoned buildings are exactly as shown in the 1969 photographs, but the snow around them is disturbed by fresh footprints. Inside the main hall, the altar stones pulse with a faint blue light that matches the frequency pattern of the transmission. On the walls, centuries-old carvings depict a creature that feeds not on voices, but on the vibrations of human consciousness itself. The revelation hits me like a physical blow. The stitches aren't meant to silence the victims. They're meant to create a specific resonance pattern with their muffled screams. Each sealed mouth becomes part of a larger instrument, tuned to a frequency that's been building for decades. The cultists weren't trying to contain something. They were trying to summon it. And now, thanks to modern radio technology, the signal has reached critical mass. In the center of the compound, I find a shortwave radio that looks brand new. Its display shows a countdown timer synchronized to my smashed watch's last reading. As the sun sets behind the mountains, casting long shadows through the broken windows, I hear cars approaching on the snow-covered road. Dozens of them. Their headlights illuminate the falling snow, and I can see the drivers through their windshields, all of them moving their lips in perfect unison, silver threads glinting in the dying light. The ancient texts in the compound's library have revealed a truth more horrifying than I could have imagined. The entity isn't just drawn to human voices. It's a parasitic frequency that has existed since before humans first learned to speak. Our ancestors discovered it by accident. When they first began using caves as resonance chambers for their rituals, the cave paintings weren't art. They were warnings about what happens when you sing at the wrong frequency. Through my radio equipment, I've been documenting the changes in the signal pattern. It's not random noise. It's a complex mathematical sequence that repeats every 27 years because that's how long it takes for human vocal patterns to naturally align with its fundamental frequency. The Whispering Circle knew this. They weren't trying to prevent the summoning, they were trying to control it. The stitching ritual was their attempt to create a living frequency modulator using human vocal cords. The compound is full now. Hundreds of people have arrived, their cars abandoned in the snow. They move through the buildings like sleepwalkers, each with silver threads weaving through their lips in intricate patterns. I hide in the radio room, watching through a crack in the door as they arrange themselves in concentric circles around the altar stones. Their muffled humming creates standing waves that I can actually see in the air, geometric patterns of vibrating light that match the carvings on the walls. Among the cult's papers, I find personnel files dating back centuries. The same names appear generation after generation, but it's their photographs that chill me to the bone. Despite decades between them, the people look identical, not just similar, but exactly the same. In the margins of these files are notes about vessel preparation and frequency harmonization. The cultists weren't just silencing people, they were turning them into living tuning forks, creating perfect copies that would resonate across generations. A high-pitched tone cuts through the compound, and I watch in horror as the silver threads begin to glow. They're not threads at all. They're tiny filaments of pure sound, made visible by their vibration. The people in the circles aren't just humming anymore. Their sealed mouths are emitting a frequency that makes my vision blur. The altar stones rise from the ground, floating on waves of sonic energy. In their reflective surfaces, I see something beginning to take form, a shape made of crystallized sound waves. Folding through dimensions that shouldn't exist, my own lips begin to tingle as the frequency reaches its peak. Through the windows, I see more headlights approaching on every road leading to the compound. The entire region is being drawn here, called by a sound that's been waiting for this moment for 27 years. But as I study the cult's calculations, I notice something they missed, a flaw in their mathematical model that could either save us all or tear reality apart at its seams. With trembling hands, I reach for my radio equipment, knowing I have only minutes to make a decision that will affect every voice in the Adirondacks. The mathematical flaw in the cult's calculations wasn't an error, it was a deliberate blind spot. As I modify my radio equipment with trembling hands, I understand the true purpose of the 27-year cycle. It was never about summoning the entity, it was about feeding it just enough to keep it dormant. But someone has changed the frequency, turning a containment ritual into an awakening. The entity isn't being summoned, it's breaking free. My modified transmitter sends out a counter-frequency that makes the air ripple like heat waves. The assembled crowd's humming falters for a moment. And in that brief silence, I hear something that turns my blood to ice. Beneath their synchronized tones is another sound, the voice of the first person who ever discovered this frequency, still screaming after thousands of years. The entity doesn't just consume voices, it preserves them in an eternal moment of harmonic agony. The floating altar stones begin to crack, releasing pulses of blue-white energy that coalesce into impossible geometries. Through the fracturing dimensional barriers, I see the entity's true form, a living constellation of crystallized screams, each point of light, a captured voice stretching back to the dawn of human speech. The silver threads around everyone's mouths begin to unravel, reaching toward the entity like metallic tendrils drawn to a magnet. I realize with horror that they were never threads at all. They're the crystallized remnants of every scream that was never allowed to escape in the cult's ancient texts. I find a passage that changes everything. The frequency fears not silence, but discord. The cultists had it backwards all this time. The stitches weren't meant to silence, they were meant to create perfect harmony. And in that moment, I understand what I have to do. I grab my radio microphone and begin broadcasting every discordant sound I can generate. Static, feedback, distorted frequencies that clash and grate against the entity's perfect harmonies. The pain in my head is excruciating, but I don't stop. The crowd's synchronized humming breaks apart as my counter-frequencies disrupt their resonance. The silver threads begin to dissipate like morning mist. And through the cacophony, I hear something new. The sound of trapped voices breaking free. The entity writhes in the air above the altar stones, its crystalline structure fragmenting under the assault of pure acoustic chaos. But as it weakens, I feel something changing in my own voice. Each word I speak emerges as a different frequency, harmonizing with the thousands of voices being released. In the end, it comes down to a choice. I can feel the entity offering me the power to control all frequencies, to become a living conductor of its horrible symphony. The cult leaders must have faced this same temptation every 27 years, and some of them must have given in, explaining the identical faces in their personnel files. Instead, I turn every dial to maximum, broadcasting a frequency that no human voice should be able to produce. As the entity shatters like a crystal goblet struck by its resonant frequency, I feel the silver threads attempting to sew my own mouth shut. But I don't stop screaming until the last echo fades from the mountains, leaving behind nothing but the soft sound of falling snow and the first natural sounds I've heard in days. Hundreds of people finding their voices again, each one beautifully, perfectly discordant. The body was found just off Route 17, another victim of Maine's merciless winter. As I adjusted my camera settings, the morning frost crunched beneath my boots, each step a reminder of how the cold could preserve both evidence and secrets. Being a forensic photographer means I've seen my share of death, but something about this morning felt different. The air carried a thickness that had nothing to do with the fog rolling in from the surrounding forest. When I finished documenting the scene, Detective Morris nodded his thanks, and I started packing my gear. That's when I saw it, a metallic glint through the trees that shouldn't have been there. I told myself I was just being thorough when I decided to investigate. Professional curiosity, that's all it was. The dense undergrowth tore at my jacket as I pushed deeper into the woods, following that distant metallic reflection. The trees began to thin, and suddenly I was standing at the edge of a perfect circular clearing. 7 vintage trailers, arranged in an exact circle, their chrome surfaces dulled by years of exposure. They sat there like ancient sentinels, their windows dark and accusing. My camera was in my hands before I even thought about it. The familiar click-whir of the shutter providing little comfort in the unnatural silence. The trailers were from different decades. I could tell that much from their designs. A sleek Airstream from the 50s sat opposite a boxy Winnebago from the 70s, yet they all shared the same state of decay. As if they'd been abandoned on the exact same day, the grass within the circle was unnaturally short, almost manicured, while the surrounding forest loomed wild and untamed. As I stepped between 2 of the trailers to enter the circle, the temperature dropped so suddenly I could see my breath crystallize in front of me. A wave of dizziness hit me. and for a moment the world seemed to tilt sideways. The first thing I noticed was the smell, musty and thick, like old books left to rot in a flooded basement. But there was something else underneath it, something that reminded me of the morgue where I sometimes had to work. The closest trailer's door hung slightly ajar, swaying gently despite the complete absence of wind. My fingers trembled as I raised my camera again, trying to capture the strange play of light on its surface. Through my viewfinder, I could have sworn I saw faces in the reflected forest, dozens of them, watching me from between the trees. I should have left right then. Every instinct, every lesson learned from years of working with law enforcement screamed at me to walk away. Instead, I found myself moving closer to that first trailer, drawn by something I couldn't explain. The door's hinges groaned in protest as I pushed it wider, the sound echoing far longer than it should have in the still air. Inside, everything was pristine. Too pristine. The interior looked like a perfect snapshot of 1956. Down to the half-finished cup of coffee on the small dining table, but it was impossible. No abandoned trailer could look this preserved. As I stepped inside to take a closer look, the door slammed shut behind me with a finality that shook the entire trailer. The coffee cup on the table began to vibrate. And then I heard it. A child's laughter, followed by a woman's scream. The walls of the trailer seemed to pulse. And suddenly, the pristine interior transformed before my eyes. Blood began seeping from the walls, and in the small bathroom mirror at the end of the trailer, I saw a reflection that wasn't my own. It was a face I recognized, one I'd tried desperately to forget. The face of someone I'd failed to save years ago, when I was still new to forensic photography, and now I was about to learn why these trailers had been waiting here all this time for someone just like me. The mirror's surface rippled like disturbed water, and I stumbled backward, knocking over the pristine coffee cup. It shattered, but instead of coffee, dark red liquid spread across the linoleum floor. The face in the mirror belonged to Sarah Martinez, a 17-year-old murder victim whose crime scene I'd photographed 5 years ago. Her case had gone cold, partly because I'd failed to capture a crucial detail in my photos, a detail that might have led to her killer. The guilt of that failure had haunted me ever since, but I'd never expected to face it like this. Sarah's reflection spoke, her voice echoing with an otherworldly resonance that made my bones ache. "You're not the first to find us, Nathan," she said, blood trickling from the corner of her mouth. "Look outside." Against my better judgment, I turned toward the window. The forest had vanished, replaced by an endless expanse of darkness punctuated by floating points of light, like stars but too close, too alive. Between these lights, I saw faces, dozens of them, hundreds perhaps, all trapped in expressions of eternal torment. They were the others who had found this place, each caught in their own personal hell. A sharp knock on the trailer's door made me jump. When I turned back to the mirror, Sarah was gone, but the blood remained pooling around my feet. The knock came again, more insistent this time. "Hello?" A woman's voice called out. "Is someone in there, please? I've been trapped here for, I don't even know how long anymore." Her voice cracked with desperation. I approached the door cautiously, my hand hovering over the handle. The blood that had been spreading across the floor began to recede, drawing back like a tide, gathering into symbols I recognized from old occult texts I'd photographed for police records. Opening the door revealed a woman in her 40s, wearing clothes that looked about a decade out of date. She introduced herself as Rebecca Thorne, a former history professor who'd discovered the circle 3 years ago, or was it 30? Time, she explained, moved differently here. Each trailer, she said, her eyes darting nervously between the other vehicles, is a gateway, not just to our guilt, but to something older, something that feeds on it. She showed me her research, notes scrawled in a weathered journal about a cult that had operated in these woods in the 1930s. They called themselves the Shepherds of Eternal Remembrance, and they believed that true salvation could only be achieved through endless penance. The temperature dropped again, and Rebecca's breath caught in her throat. "They're coming," she whispered. "The shepherds. What's left of them." The lights in all 7 trailers began to flicker in unison. a rhythmic pulsing that matched the beating of my heart through the windows of the other trailers. I could see figures moving, shadowy forms that shouldn't have been able to exist in such small spaces. Rebecca grabbed my arm, her fingers ice cold. "There's a way out," she said urgently. "But first we have to understand why we were chosen. Your guilt, my guilt. It's all connected. The girl in your mirror. Tell me about her." Before I could answer, a deep, resonant tone began to emanate from the center of the circle. The ground between the trailers started to sink, revealing worn stone steps descending into darkness. Carved into each step were more symbols, matching those formed by the blood in the trailer. Rebecca's face went pale. "I've never seen this before," she whispered. "Something's different this time. Something's changed." She was right. Whatever force governed this place had been waiting for someone specific, and somehow I knew with crushing certainty that it had been waiting for me. As we stood there, watching the stairs appear, I realized that Sarah Martinez's unsolved case was just the beginning of a much darker story, one that had started long before I ever set foot in this clearing. The stone steps seemed to absorb what little light remained in the clearing, each one darker than the last. Rebecca clutched her journal to her chest as we descended, the pages rustling with an almost sentient agitation. The air grew thick with the scent of wet earth and something else, something metallic and ancient. Our footsteps echoed strangely, as if the space below was much larger than it should have been. The deeper we went, the more I felt Sarah's presence watching us, her unseen eyes burning with accusation. At the bottom of the stairs, we found a chamber that defied logic, a vast circular room that couldn't possibly exist beneath the trailer circle above. 7 stone archways lined the walls, each corresponding to a trailer's position. Between them hung tapestries so old they seemed to be holding together by mere memory, their surfaces covered in the same symbols we'd seen before. But it was what stood in the center of the room that made my blood run cold, a pedestal holding a massive leather-bound book. Its cover made from something that looked disturbingly like human skin. Rebecca moved toward it as if in a trance, her hands shaking as she reached for its pages. The book was a chronicle, documenting every person who had ever entered the circle since the Shepherds created it in 1932. Each entry detailed not just names and dates, but the specific guilts that had drawn them here. As Rebecca read aloud, I recognized patterns emerging. Every victim had something in common with the others, chains of connected regrets spanning decades. My own guilt over Sarah Martinez's case wasn't random. It was part of a larger design. The Shepherds hadn't just built a trap for the guilty. They'd created a machine designed to harvest specific types of regret, building towards something terrible. The chamber's temperature plummeted suddenly, and the tapestries began to move without wind. From one of the archways came a sound I recognized, the click whir of a camera shutter. Stepping through it was another version of myself, but wrong somehow, twisted. It was me as I had been on the day I photographed Sarah's crime scene, but with eyes that held the same darkness I'd seen in the trailer's mirrors. "You knew?" my doppelganger said, its voice like gravel. "You knew what you saw in those original crime scene photos, but you chose to ignore it. Tell her why." Rebecca turned to me, her eyes wide with dawning horror. The truth I'd buried for 5 years clawed its way up my throat. In one of my photographs of Sarah's crime scene, barely visible in the background, I'd caught a glimpse of someone watching from the woods, someone I recognized, someone whose reputation and career I'd chosen to protect by burying the evidence. But that wasn't even the worst of it. The figure in my photograph had been wearing a pendant around their neck, the exact same symbol that now adorned these underground walls. The murderer had been connected to the Shepherds, and by hiding that truth, I'd become part of their grand design without knowing it. As this revelation echoed through the chamber, the book on the pedestal began to glow with an inner light, its pages turning by themselves. Rebecca gasped as it stopped on a new entry, one that was writing itself before our eyes. The words described not just my guilt over Sarah's case, but every dark secret I'd ever kept. And below that, in blood-red ink, was a single sentence that made my heart stop. The seventh seal is broken. The ground began to shake, and from all 7 archways came the sound of screaming, not in pain or fear, but in triumph. The shepherds hadn't created this place as a prison for the guilty. They'd built it as a gateway, and now, after 90 years of gathering power through the torment of trapped souls, something was finally coming through. The screaming ceased abruptly, replaced by a silence so complete it felt like a physical weight. The book's pages continued turning, faster now, releasing clouds of ancient dust that formed shapes in the air. Faces I recognized from old case files, all victims whose killers had never been caught. Rebecca backed away from the pedestal, her journal falling from trembling fingers. "They're all connected," she whispered. "Every single death, they were sacrifices, and you were chosen to be the final piece." My doppelganger began to laugh, the sound multiplying until it seemed to come from every direction. Its form flickered and changed, cycling through the appearances of everyone I'd failed over the years. It settled finally on a face I hadn't allowed myself to remember in 20 years, my younger brother, Tommy. "Show her what really started all this," it said in Tommy's voice. "Show her what happened that summer at the lake." The memory I'd buried deeper than all others threatened to surface, but I fought it down. The chamber's walls pulsed in response to my resistance, and black liquid began seeping from between the stones. Rebecca's eyes went wide as she flipped through her journal frantically. "The seventh seal," she said, her voice rising with urgency. "It's not just about guilt. It's about willing blindness. The shepherds believe that those who choose not to see the truth are the perfect conduits for—" She never finished the sentence. The black liquid reaching her feet suddenly surged upward, wrapping around her legs like living rope. She screamed as it pulled her toward one of the archways, her fingers leaving desperate scratches in the stone floor. I tried to grab her hand, but my doppelganger held me back with impossible strength. "You have to remember," it said in Tommy's voice. "That's the only way to stop this." The memory crashed through my mental barriers like a tsunami. Summer 1994. Tommy and I at our family's lake house. The strange lights we saw in the woods. The old man who'd approached us wearing the shepherd's symbol around his neck, promising to show us something wonderful. I'd run away, but Tommy had followed him. When I finally told our parents hours later, it was too late. They never found his body, and I'd convinced myself over the years that he must have drowned in the lake. But the truth was in that book now, written in burning letters. I had seen where the old man had taken him. I had seen the trailer circle, even back then, and I had chosen to forget. The chamber shuddered violently, and the black liquid began flowing up the walls, covering the tapestries. My doppelganger's form shifted again, but this time into something inhuman. A mass of shadows with too many eyes, all wearing the same accusatory expression as Sarah Martinez. "Your brother was the first," it said in a voice like breaking glass. "His innocence opened the door, but your guilt kept it open. Every time you chose not to see the truth, every time you looked away from evidence that might have saved someone, you fed us. And now, the thing that wore my brother's eyes smiled, revealing teeth made of darkness. Now we're hungry for more than just guilt." As if responding to those words, the book on the pedestal burst into black flames. The chamber's ceiling began to crack, revealing not the forest above, but a vast, starless void. Rebecca's screams had stopped. She was gone, absorbed into whatever waited behind those archways. The doppelganger released me, and I fell to my knees as the truth of my complicity crushed down on me like a physical weight. I hadn't just failed to save Sarah Martinez and countless others. I'd been helping the shepherds all along, playing my part in a plan set in motion the day I let my brother walk into these woods. But as the chamber crumbled around me, I realized there might still be a way to make it right. The seventh seal required willing blindness, and I could finally choose to see. The black flames from the book began to take shape, forming a spiraling corridor of fire that stretched infinitely upward into the void. Through the flames, I could see fragments of memories, not just mine, but those of everyone who had ever been trapped here. Sarah Martinez's final moments, Rebecca's first discovery of the circle, and countless other torments played out like a grotesque film reel. But it was the memory of Tommy that burned brightest, and now I could see it in its entirety for the first time in 20 years. The old man hadn't just led Tommy into the woods. He had led him through each trailer in sequence, performing a ritual at each stop. I had followed them, staying just far enough behind to remain unseen. In the final trailer, they had drawn symbols on the floor, the same symbols that now covered these chamber walls. Tommy had looked scared, but the old man had promised him that fear was the price of seeing true wonders. I could have stopped it. I should have stopped it. Instead, I had watched as my brother was bound to the circle, his innocence and my cowardice forming the foundation of what would become a decades-long harvest of guilt and regret. The doppelganger that wore my brother's face began to change again, its form expanding to fill the chamber with writhing shadows. "You were our masterpiece," it said in a chorus of voices, the old man's, Tommy's, Sarah's, and countless others. Each time you turned away from the truth, each time you chose not to see what was in front of you, you strengthened the seals. But now, the shadows parted, revealing what looked like a doorway made of twisted human forms. Now you can make one final choice. Through the doorway, I could see Tommy as he was that summer day, perpetually on the threshold of his fate. The shadows whispered promises. I could go back, change everything, save him and all the others who had followed. But I finally understood. That's how they had snared every soul who ended up here. The promise of redemption was just another form of willing blindness. The true purpose of the circle was never about punishment or penance. It was about teaching people to look away, to choose comfortable lies over painful truths. The chamber's destruction accelerated, chunks of ceiling falling into the void above. The doppelganger's laughter echoed as reality itself seemed to bend around us. But in that moment of clarity, I saw what I had to do. I pulled out my camera, the same one that had captured half-truths and hidden evidence for years, and started taking pictures. Every symbol, every shadow, every twisted face in the void. The flash illuminated things that should have remained hidden, and the shadows recoiled with each exposure. "You can't photograph darkness," the doppelganger hissed. "You can't capture what isn't there." "No," I replied, continuing to shoot even as the void tried to swallow my camera's light. "But I can capture what is there, what's always been there." With each photo, the truth became clearer. The shepherds hadn't created this place. They had found it. And like me, they had chosen to look away from what it really was. The circle of trailers, the endless torments, the harvested guilt. It was all a facade for something far simpler and more terrifying. Humanity's capacity to ignore the darkness right in front of us. As I took the final picture, aiming directly at what remained of my doppelganger, the chamber erupted in a blast of purifying light. The void collapsed in on itself. Taking the shadows with it, the book of records crumbled to ash, and the archways sealed themselves with a sound like 1,000 screaming voices being silenced at once. When the light faded, I found myself standing in the circle of trailers again. They were just trailers now, old, abandoned, and perfectly ordinary in the morning sun. But my camera held the truth. Every frame a testament to what happens when we choose to see. Sarah Martinez's case file would be reopened the next day, along with dozens of others. The evidence had always been there in my photographs, waiting for someone to really look at it. Tommy's fate would remain a mystery, but not a hidden one. His story, and the story of the shepherds, would finally be told. As I walked out of the circle for the last time, I understood that some guilt cannot be absolved, only acknowledged. The trailers would remain as a monument to that truth, their chrome surfaces reflecting everything we try not to see, waiting for the next person brave enough, or foolish enough, to really look. The Olympic National Forest welcomed me with its ancient silence, towering evergreens stretching endlessly into the misty horizon. I came here seeking peace, or maybe just numbness, driving my old Honda through winding roads until I found Evergreen Haven, a vintage trailer park that would become my sanctuary or my tomb. The sign creaked in the wind, its faded letters barely visible against the weathered wood. It had been 3 months since I lost everything, and solitude seemed like the only answer left. My assigned trailer sat at the edge of the park, its metallic skin dulled by years of rain and neglect. The manager, an elderly man named Tom, had barely looked at my paperwork when I registered under my new name, Maria Santos. He just nodded, handed me the keys, and mumbled something about keeping to myself. I could tell from his averted gaze that he recognized the look in my eyes, the hollow stare of someone running from their past. The other residents, scattered across the dozen or so trailers, seemed to share that same haunted expression. The first night passed uneventfully, filled with the gentle patter of rain against aluminum and the distant hooting of owls. I tried not to think about the photos I'd buried at the bottom of my suitcase, or the newspapers I'd burned before leaving Seattle. Sleep came in fitful bursts, interrupted by the familiar nightmares. But it was during one of these midnight wakings that I first noticed something wrong with my reflection in the trailer's window. A shadow that moved differently than it should. A darkness that seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat. Morning brought a strange green mist that clung to the ground, weaving between the trailers like ghostly fingers. I watched my neighbors emerge from their homes, each performing their own careful routine of avoidance and silence. Mrs. Chen from Trailer 7 watered her potted plants. Mr. Rodriguez from Trailer 3 checked his mailbox, and the young couple in Trailer 12 walked their dog. Normal scenes from a normal day, except for one detail that made my blood run cold. When they passed by their windows, their reflections showed something else, something dead. I first noticed it clearly when Mrs. Chen walked past her kitchen window. Her reflection wasn't just a mirror image. It was her, but wrong. The reflected version had sunken cheeks, blackened eyes, and skin that hung loose like wet paper. She didn't seem to notice, but I saw it. And when she turned away, her reflection lingered for a moment too long, its head tilting at an impossible angle before fading into the glass. I spent the rest of the morning watching, counting the moments between when someone would pass a window and when their reflection would finally follow. That evening, Trailer 7 went dark. Mrs. Chen's plants remained unwatered the next day, their leaves already beginning to wilt. When Tom went to check on her, he found only an empty trailer, the windows covered in condensation that seemed to pulse like breathing lungs. But what terrified me most wasn't her disappearance. It was catching a glimpse of her face in my own window that night, watching me from behind the glass with those hollow, hungry eyes. And when I blinked, she was gone, leaving only my own reflection. But even that didn't look quite right anymore. The memory came unbidden, as it always did. In the darkest hours of the night, 6 months ago, I wasn't Maria Santos, I was Isabella Torres. Happily married and teaching art at a Seattle elementary school, my son Miguel had just turned 7, his dark eyes always sparkling with mischief and wonder. That rainy February evening, I was grading papers while he played in his room. Just 10 minutes, I told myself, 10 minutes of not watching him. The crash came first, then the silence. By the time I reached his bedroom, the window was open, the curtains dancing in the storm wind, and Miguel was gone. They found his body 3 days later, washed up on the shores of Lake Washington. Thunder rolled across the trailer park, pulling me back to the present. The storm that approached wasn't natural. The clouds swirled with an otherworldly green luminescence that reminded me of the northern lights, but somehow wrong, somehow hungry. The few remaining residents huddled in their trailers, but I could feel their eyes watching through their windows, their reflections growing darker and more twisted with each lightning flash. I tried calling for help, but the phone lines were dead and my cell phone showed only static. The rain, when it finally came, fell upward. I watched from my trailer window as droplets rose from the ground like reverse tears, each one glowing with that sickly green light. The water formed patterns on the glass, faces, hands, mouths opened in silent screams. Among them, I saw Mrs. Chen's face again, but this time she wasn't alone. Mr. Rodriguez was there too, though I hadn't seen him in 2 days. His reflection showed bloated flesh and seawater eyes, reaching toward me with webbed fingers that left trails of phosphorescent slime on the glass. A knock at my door made me jump. It was Tom, the manager. his face pale and drawn. "They're all connected," he whispered, glancing nervously at the windows. "The reflections, the disappearances. It's happening again." Before I could ask what he meant, a flash of green lightning illuminated his face. And for a moment, I saw through him, saw the rotting corpse that waited behind his living flesh. He knew it too. "I should have warned you," he said, backing away. "But they wouldn't let me. They never let me." That was the last time I saw Tom alive. The storm raged for 3 days, during which the barrier between reflection and reality grew thinner. I watched as more residents disappeared, replaced by their darker selves that moved through the park like shadows given flesh. They all seemed drawn to the old maintenance shed behind Trailer 12, where the young couple used to live. Through my window, I could see their dog still chained outside. But it wasn't really their dog anymore. Its reflection showed matted fur and exposed bone, and when it barked, the sound came from behind the glass instead of the creature itself. On the third night, exhausted and half mad from lack of sleep, I found Miguel's photo at the bottom of my suitcase, but when I held it up, the reflection showed something different. My son was there, but older, changed, his sweet smile replaced by something hungry and cold, and behind him, reflected in the window of his childhood bedroom, I finally saw what had taken him that night, the same thing that now stalked the residents of Evergreen Haven, wearing our reflections like masks, feeding on our grief and guilt. As I stared into those impossible depths, I realized with growing horror that it had been waiting for me all along. The maintenance shed held secrets beneath its weathered walls. In the green-tinged darkness, I found Tom's journal hidden beneath loose floorboards. Its pages filled with frantic sketches and notes spanning decades, the truth spilled out in his shaky handwriting. Evergreen Haven wasn't just a trailer park. It was built on what the local Native Americans called the place of broken mirrors, where the membrane between worlds wore thin. Tom had been its keeper, maintaining the delicate balance between our reality and what he called the reflection realm, a parallel dimension that fed on human suffering. According to the journal, the entities from this realm couldn't create their own forms. They needed to steal them from our world, using reflective surfaces as doorways. But they couldn't just take anyone. They needed people marked by trauma, souls already fractured by grief and guilt. People like me, the disappearing residents, weren't random victims. We had been carefully selected, our pain acting like a beacon drawing these creatures to us. Mrs. Chen had lost her entire family in a house fire. Mr. Rodriguez was a war veteran haunted by decisions made in combat. The young couple in Trailer 12 had lost their unborn child. The storm intensified as I pieced together the puzzle. In the windows of every trailer, the reflections had begun to move independently, enacting grotesque pantomimes of their host's worst memories. Through my own window, I watched myself discover Miguel's empty room over and over, each iteration more twisted than the last. But in one reflection, I caught something new, a glimpse of my son alive, standing in a green-lit version of our old home. When he turned to face me, his eyes were filled with the same otherworldly light that now illuminated the park. A series of Polaroid photos fell from the journal's final pages, images of previous residents dating back to the 1970s. Each photo showed people standing in front of their trailers, smiling for the camera, but their reflections in the windows behind them told a different story, showing their true fates. The most recent photo was of Tom himself, and as I studied it, I realized with horror that the Tom I'd met was already a replacement. The real Tom had been gone for years. His reflection, self-maintaining the park, guiding new grief-stricken souls to their doom. The young couple's dog began howling, a sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Through the window, I watched its reflection decompose in real time, flesh melting away until only a skeletal form remained. But it was still moving, still howling, and in its hollow eye sockets burned that same green light. The chain holding it snapped, and both dog and reflection vanished into the maintenance shed. Following it, I discovered a door that hadn't been there before, its surface reflecting not my face, but an endless corridor lined with windows. each one showing a different moment of loss, a different soul trapped in eternal torment. That's when I understood the true nature of what we were facing. These weren't just monsters stealing our forms. They were collectors, archivists of human suffering, preserving moments of ultimate loss in their twisted museum. And now, through the growing storm, they were preparing for their largest acquisition. Yet in my window's reflection, I saw Miguel again. But this time he wasn't alone. Mrs. Chen, Mr. Rodriguez, Tom, and countless others stood with him in that green-lit realm, their faces both familiar and wrong. They were waiting for me, and behind them all, finally revealing itself, stood the curator of this gallery of pain, a being made entirely of reflected grief. Wearing fragments of every soul it had ever collected, the curator's realm pulsed behind every reflective surface in Evergreen Haven. Its green light growing stronger with each passing hour, Tom's journal revealed more than just the history of the park. It contained a confession. Every keeper before him had been chosen for their guilt. Their regret so deep it created a natural conduit between worlds. Tom's sin had been allowing the entities to take the residents, justifying each loss as necessary to maintain the balance. But in his final entries, he'd discovered something the creatures feared: genuine acceptance and forgiveness of one's past. Standing before my trailer's window, I forced myself to watch my reflection reveal the truth I'd been running from. That night with Miguel wasn't just a tragic accident. I'd been angry with him that day, exhausted from weeks of single parenting while my husband worked overseas. When I heard him playing instead of getting ready for bed, I'd snapped, said words no mother should say. Miguel ran to his room crying, the open window, the fall. It wasn't just neglect. My anger had driven him there. The guilt of this revelation brought me to my knees, the green light pulsing in sympathy with my grief. The storm reached its peak as I made my way through the park, past empty trailers that had become monuments to lost souls. Their windows showed scenes from the other side. Mrs. Chen embracing her family in an endless inferno. Mr. Rodriguez reliving his final mission in an eternal loop. The young couple cradling their never-born child in a hospital frozen in time. Each reflection was a prison cell in the curator's collection, powered by the inmates' inability to forgive themselves. That's when I understood what I had to do to free them all. In the maintenance shed, I found scattered pieces of broken mirrors, each shard containing a fragment of someone's suffering. The ritual described in Tom's final pages was simple but devastating. To break the curator's power, someone would have to enter its realm willingly, carrying not grief or guilt, but acceptance. The catch was that this acceptance had to be absolute, extending not just to one's own actions, but to the very nature of loss itself. As I arranged the shards in a circle, I saw Miguel watching me from each piece, his expression shifting between accusation and plea. The young couple's skeletal dog appeared in the mirror shards, but this time I recognized it for what it was: a guide, a creature that straddled both worlds, neither fully real nor fully reflection. Its hollow eyes held not malice but urgency. Through the fragments I watched as the curator began its final collection, drawing the trapped souls deeper into its realm, preparing to seal them away forever in its gallery of eternal regret. I had until dawn to complete the ritual, to make peace with my role in Miguel's death, or lose my chance to save not only him but all the others. What the journal hadn't revealed, what I discovered only as I began the ritual, was the true price of entering the curator's realm. Each shard of mirror showed me a different version of that fatal night, forcing me to relive every moment, every decision, every word spoken in anger. But this time I had to do more than just remember. I had to accept each moment fully, without the shield of guilt I'd been hiding behind. And as the green light grew stronger, I realized that the curator wasn't just collecting our suffering, it was protecting us from the harder truth that sometimes there is no one to blame, not even ourselves. The portal opened like a wound in reality, each mirror shard pulsing with green luminescence as I completed the ritual. The maintenance sheet dissolved around me, replaced by an endless gallery of windows floating in a void of emerald mist. Each window was a moment frozen in time, a perfect capture of someone's deepest regret. I saw hundreds of faces pressed against these transparent prisons, past residents of Evergreen Haven, their features twisted in eternal anguish. The skeletal dog padded silently beside me, its bones glowing with the same otherworldly light that permeated this realm. The curator revealed itself gradually, assembling its form from countless reflections. It wore faces like masks, each one showing a different tragedy. Mothers who'd lost children, fathers who'd failed their families, lovers who'd arrived too late. But as it approached, I saw something that stopped my heart. Beneath all those borrowed faces was one I recognized, my own face, decades older, worn by grief and time. This wasn't just any entity. It was me, or what I would become if I let my guilt consume me forever. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. The curator was born from my future grief, reaching backward through time, collecting others' pain to feed its own endless hunger. Miguel appeared in the nearest window, but this time I saw him clearly, not as the accusatory spirit of my guilt, but as he truly was in his final moments. The curator had been lying in those last seconds before his fall. He wasn't running from my anger, he was chasing his toy plane, launched in excitement rather than fear. The window showed his face lit with joy, not terror. My guilt had corrupted this memory, twisted it into something darker, and the curator had fed on that corruption, used it to build its collection of suffering souls. All around me, the trapped residents began to stir as this realization rippled through the gallery. Mrs. Chen's eternal fire dimmed as she saw her family's love rather than their loss. Mr. Rodriguez's war zone transformed into a memory of those he'd saved rather than those he'd lost. The young couple's hospital scene filled with light as they finally accepted that their love was stronger than their loss. Each acceptance cracked the windows that held them, fractures spreading like spiderwebs through the curator's carefully maintained prison. The entity lunged at me, its form shifting frantically between faces, trying to find one that would rekindle my guilt. It showed me Miguel's body in the lake, my angry words echoing through the void. The endless possibilities of what could have been. But with each vision, I responded with acceptance rather than grief. I was a good mother, I declared, my voice gaining strength. I loved him fully. His death was a tragedy, but not a punishment. With each truth, the curator's form became more unstable. The green light flickering like a failing bulb, the final revelation came as the realm began to collapse around us. The curator wasn't just collecting souls marked by grief, it was trying to prevent something it saw as worse. Letting go, every soul it had trapped was held in a moment of perfect pain, preserved in the amber of guilt, never healing but never fading. In its twisted way, it thought it was saving us from the agony of acceptance and moving forward. As this understanding filled me, I saw tears of green light falling upward from the curator's multitude of eyes. It had been born from the most human of desires, the wish to hold on to our loved ones, even through pain, even when we should let them go. It's time, I whispered, reaching out to touch my future self's face in the curator's fractured form. The contact sent shockwaves through the realm, every window shattered simultaneously, releasing their captives in a cascade of breaking glass and fading screams. The skeletal dog howled one final time, its bones collapsing into dust that rose upward like the rain had done. Through the falling shards of the curator's broken collection, I saw Miguel one last time, not as a victim or an accusation, but as my son. Smiling free and finally at peace, the green light faded, replaced by the natural grey of a dawn breaking over Evergreen Haven, where the maintenance shed had stood. There was now only a single unbroken window, showing nothing but my own reflection. Tired, aged by experience, but unburdened by guilt, and in the distance, carried by the morning wind, I heard children laughing. The smell hit me first, an overwhelming mixture of wet moss and rotting wood that seemed out of place even for Montana's dense forests. I'd been a ranger at Blackwood Pines Trailer Park for 3 years, but something felt different during my midnight patrol that October evening. The crisp autumn air carried whispers through the ancient pines, and the beam of my flashlight caught glimpses of unusual shadows dancing between the trailers. Mrs. Henderson's wind chimes had stopped their familiar tinkling, though the breeze still rustled through the campground. I approached her trailer, my boots crunching on fallen leaves that seemed to curl away from my steps. The windows were dark, but something about the silence made my skin crawl. I'd never known her to be in bed this early. She was our resident insomniac, always offering coffee to anyone working the night shift. The first scream came from the Wilsons' lot, 3 trailers down. It wasn't the kind of scream you'd expect from someone being attacked or frightened. It was deeper, more guttural, like wood creaking under immense pressure. My hand instinctively went to my sidearm as I sprinted toward the sound, but nothing in my training could have prepared me for what I found. Their trailer door hung open, swaying gently in the wind, and the porch light flickered erratically, casting strange shadows on the ground. Inside, the air was thick with an earthy, almost sweet scent. Tom Wilson sat rigid in his recliner. His skin had taken on a peculiar grayish tint, and when I touched his shoulder, the texture beneath my fingers wasn't skin at all. It felt rough, like bark. His eyes were open but glazed over, staring at something I couldn't see, and when I checked his pulse, I swear I could feel sap moving beneath the surface. The radio at my belt crackled to life, making me jump. Through the static, I could barely make out the voice of Mike from the ranger station. "Nathan, you need to see this. The Henderson woman. Something's wrong, really wrong." I looked back at Tom Wilson, his form seemingly more wooden than before, and realized this was just the beginning of whatever horror had taken root in our quiet corner of Montana. As I made my way to Mrs. Henderson's trailer, I noticed something else. The trees around the park seemed closer than before, their branches reaching toward the trailers like grasping fingers. The forest had always bordered the park, but now it felt like it was slowly closing in, consuming the spaces between homes. And in the distance, I could have sworn I heard the sound of roots breaking through soil, creeping ever closer in the darkness. Mrs. Henderson's trailer had become a twisted monument to the horror unfolding in Blackwood Pines. Her body, or what remained of it, was fused to her favorite rocking chair, bark-like protrusions erupting from her flesh in geometric patterns. Her fingers had elongated into branch-like appendages, reaching toward her ceiling where clusters of leaves had begun sprouting from her fingertips. The sight made my stomach turn, but I couldn't look away, especially when I noticed her eyes tracking my movement. The transformation seemed to be spreading faster now. Within hours of my first discovery, calls started flooding in from across the park. The Martinez family's teenage son was found rooted to his bed, his legs splitting into woody tendrils that burrowed through the trailer's floor. His mother, hysterical, claimed she could hear him whispering even though his mouth had sealed shut, replaced by rings of bark that aged him like a living tree. I documented everything with trembling hands, my camera's flash illuminating the grotesque metamorphoses. The photos showed a consistent pattern. The transformation always started at the extremities, working its way inward like some terrible infection. But it was the eyes that haunted me most. They remained human long after the rest had changed, silently pleading for help as their bodies betrayed them. Each victim remained conscious through their transformation, trapped in a living nightmare. Deep in the night, I heard singing coming from old Jack Turner's trailer. When I investigated, I found him surrounded by newly sprouted saplings that hadn't been there the day before. His skin had taken on the texture of pine bark, and from his mouth poured an ancient melody in a language I didn't recognize. The saplings swayed in rhythm with his song, despite the absence of wind. Before I could reach him, the door slammed shut on its own, and the singing transformed into the sound of splintering wood. The park's communal area had become a grotesque garden of half-human, half-tree hybrids. Some residents were frozen mid-transformation, their bodies contorted in impossible angles as branches burst from their limbs. Others had merged together, their transformed bodies creating archways of flesh and wood. The air was thick with spores that glowed faintly in my flashlight beam, and I realized too late that I'd been breathing them in all night. Sarah Chen from the convenience store managed to call me before her transformation completed. Through sobs, she described watching her young daughter change, how the child's laughter had turned to creaking, how her pigtails had become twisting vines that crept across their living room floor. As I listened to Sarah's voice gradually fade into the sound of rustling leaves, I noticed something even more terrifying. Small wooden nodules were beginning to form on my own wrists, and they were spreading fast. The ranger station's archives held secrets darker than I could have imagined. Between fits of scratching at the wooden growths now spreading across my forearms, I discovered records dating back to the 1800s. The land where Blackwood Pines now stood was once sacred ground to the Blackfeet tribe, a place where they believed the boundary between the world of flesh and the world of spirits grew thin. The photographs from early settlers showed stone circles and wooden totems that had long since vanished. I found an old journal belonging to Thomas Blackwood, the man who first developed this land. His later entries grew increasingly frantic, describing nightmares of trees that walked on legs of men and forests born from human flesh. The final pages contained detailed sketches of transformations eerily similar to what I was witnessing now. But it was his last entry that made my blood run cold. They warned us. The medicine man said the trees here were vessels for their ancestors. We didn't listen. We burned them all to build this place. A visit to the local tribal museum revealed more. The curator, an elderly woman named Margaret Running Bear, recognized the symptoms immediately. Her grandmother had passed down stories of the Green Revenge, a curse triggered when sacred trees were destroyed. According to legend, the forest itself would take revenge by reclaiming human vessels, transforming them into new vessels for the displaced spirits. The curse was supposed to be impossible to invoke now, requiring a specific ritual in the blood of the original desecrator's bloodline. The pieces started falling into place as I dug deeper into the property records. The current owner of Blackwood Pines, Charles Hammond, had changed his name. He was born Charles Blackwood, the last living descendant of Thomas Blackwood. Recent surveillance footage showed him performing strange rituals at night, painting symbols on trees with what looked like his own blood. The timing matched perfectly with when the transformations began. My research was interrupted by the sound of roots breaking through the station's walls. The wooden growths on my arms had spread to my chest, and I could feel them pulsing with a life of their own. Through the window, I watched as more residents succumbed to the curse. Mr. Peterson, the retired math teacher, had become a towering hybrid of flesh and oak. His classroom ruler still clutched in branches that were once fingers. His transformation was almost complete, but his eyes still moved, tracking a group of deer that now grazed peacefully around his rooted form. The most disturbing discovery came from an old map comparing the original sacred sites to the current layout of the trailer park. The trailers had been arranged in a pattern that mirrored the ancient stone circles, creating a massive ritual space, and at the center of it all stood Hammond's office, built on the exact spot where the oldest and most sacred tree had once stood. As night fell, I could hear chanting coming from that direction, accompanied by the synchronized creaking of dozens of transformed residents. The curse wasn't just claiming victims, it was building towards something much worse. The bark-like growths had spread across my entire torso now, each movement accompanied by the sound of creaking wood. I could feel the curse working its way through my body, transforming tissue into timber, blood into sap. The worst part wasn't the physical changes, it was the whispers. They started as soon as the sun set, ancient voices speaking in tongues that somehow, horrifyingly, I was beginning to understand. Racing against my own transformation, I tried warning the few remaining unchanged residents to evacuate. The Blackwood Pines entrance had become a twisted barrier of half-transformed victims, their bodies fused together into a living wall of flesh and wood. Emily Walsh, the park's maintenance worker, was now a grotesque hybrid standing guard. Her tool belt melded into her bark-covered waist as I approached. Her head rotated unnaturally, branches creaking, and she spoke with a voice that sounded like rustling leaves. The circle must be completed. My police contact, Detective Sarah Martinez, finally returned my desperate calls. Her horror at the photographs I'd sent quickly turned to revelation. Similar transformations had been reported in other locations, all former Blackwood properties. But before she could tell me more, I watched through my office window as roots erupted from the ground beneath her car, impaling the vehicle and dragging it underground. The last thing I heard over the phone was her scream. Cut short by the sound of splintering metal, the transformation was accelerating with the setting sun. My left arm had completely changed. Fingers elongated into twisting branches that seemed to move with a will of their own. I could feel the curse trying to root me in place, tendrils of woody flesh burrowing from my feet into the ground. The strangest part was how natural it felt. Like the human form I'd known all my life had been nothing but a temporary state. And this was my true evolution. Through the haze of my changing consciousness, I made a terrifying connection. The arrangement of transformed victims throughout the park wasn't random. They were being positioned like the roots of a massive tree. With Hammond's office at the center, each new transformation added another branch to this horrific human timber hybrid, creating a living network that pulsed with ancient power. And somehow, I could feel all of them. Their consciousness linked together in a shared vegetal nightmare. As night fully descended, I discovered I wasn't just transforming. I was connecting to something vast and alien through the curse's expanding influence. I caught glimpses of Hammond's plan. The park was just one of many similar sites, each one a node in a massive ritual decades in the making. The true horror wasn't in the transformation of individual victims, but in what we were all becoming part of. As my humanity slipped away piece by piece, I realized I had until midnight to stop Hammond before the final phase of his plan could take root. And something told me that what was happening in our small corner of Montana was just the beginning of a much larger apocalypse. The clock struck 11 as I dragged my increasingly wooden form toward Hammond's office. Each step was agony, roots attempting to sprout from my feet into the earth below. Through the windows, I could see him standing in the center of a crude circle. Surrounded by photographs of other trailer parks across the country, my transformed neighbors had completely encircled the building, their tree-like bodies swaying in unison as they chanted in that ancient tongue. I now understood all too well. Hammond turned as I burst through the door, his face split in a grin that seemed too wide for human muscles. "Nathan Cole," he said, his voice resonating with an otherworldly timbre, "the final branch of our divine tree." His skin was a patchwork of flesh and ancient bark, as though he'd been fighting the transformation for years. "Did you really think my great-grandfather built these parks for the poor? Each one sits on sacred ground, waiting for this moment. 100 parks, 100 nodes, all connected through roots that stretch across America." The truth hit me harder than any physical blow. The Blackwood family hadn't just desecrated one sacred site. They'd systematically built trailer parks on similar locations across the country. Each park was filled with society's overlooked, the poor, the elderly, the marginalized, perfect sacrifices that nobody would miss. Tonight's ritual would connect them all, creating a vast network of human tree hybrids that would spread the curse exponentially. As midnight approached, my transformation accelerated. Through our shared consciousness, I felt thousands of others changing simultaneously across the country. Hammond raised his arms, now fully wooden, and began the final incantation. But he'd made one crucial mistake. In my research at the ranger station, I'd found one detail he'd missed. The curse could be reversed if the original desecrator's bloodline ended before the ritual's completion. Fighting against my own body's betrayal, I lunged for the ritual dagger on his desk. My wooden fingers closed around it just as Hammond realized my intent. We struggled, our partially transformed bodies creaking and splintering. In our fight, the photos scattered, revealing a mapped pattern that looked eerily like a massive tree spread across the United States, with Montana as its crown. The clock began to strike midnight as I drove the blade into Hammond's chest. His eyes widened in shock, not from the wound, but from the revelation. In my final human words, I told him what I'd discovered. "I'm not just Nathan Cole. My birth name was Nathan Blackwood. Your grandfather had another child, one he never knew about. You killed my parents to consolidate the bloodline, but you missed me. Hammond's scream of denial transformed into the sound of splitting wood as his body began to crumble. Around us, the transformed victim started reverting, human screams replacing the sound of creaking branches. The curse, designed to work through the desecrator's direct bloodline, had backfired. As both Blackwood descendants died, the ritual collapsed entirely. My last human sight was Hammond's body disintegrating into mulch, feeding the very earth his family had desecrated. The curse claimed us both, but instead of transforming, we became fertilizer for new growth. Proper trees, free of human consciousness or torment. They say a new grove stands where Blackwood Pines once was. Its trees somehow greener than any others in Montana, and on quiet nights, if you listen carefully, you might hear them whisper a warning about respecting the ancient boundaries between the world of flesh and the world of wood. The mud squelched beneath our trailer's tires as I guided our home on wheels deeper into the Washington wilderness. Emma sat beside me, her camera already in hand, ready to capture the mystical fog that draped itself over the ancient trees like a funeral shroud. We'd been traveling the backcountry roads for 3 days now, seeking the perfect shots for our nature photography portfolio. The late October rain had turned the Forest Service roads into treacherous ribbons of muck, but our trusty F-150 hadn't failed us yet. I should have paid more attention to how the mud moved behind us, should have noticed how it shifted and reformed in ways that defied natural physics. The first sign that something was wrong came when Emma called me over to look at her shots from earlier that day. She had been photographing our trailer's tracks, claiming there was something artistic about the way they carved through the virgin forest floor. But as we flipped through the images on her digital display, my blood ran cold. The tracks weren't the parallel lines they should have been. Instead, they formed intricate patterns, complex geometries that reminded me of the occult symbols I'd seen in my grandmother's old books. Circles within circles, intersecting lines that formed impossible angles, and what looked disturbingly like ancient letters written in a language that had no business existing in our corner of the Pacific Northwest. Emma was fascinated, of course. She'd always been drawn to the unusual, the unexplainable. That's what made her such a brilliant photographer. She saw beauty in the bizarre. She wanted to follow the tracks back. To document how they changed and evolved, I argued against it, feeling an inexplicable dread at the thought of retracing our path. But she was insistent, and I could never say no to her enthusiasm. So we walked back along our trail, the evening light fading faster than it should have, the forest growing quieter with each step we took. The patterns grew more elaborate the further back we went. What started as simple geometric shapes had morphed into something more organic, more deliberate. Emma's camera clicked incessantly as she captured each new formation. I noticed how the mud seemed to ripple around the edges of the tracks, like something beneath the surface was still moving. Still forming, the air grew thick with an odd, sweetish smell that reminded me of the time I'd found a dead deer in my grandfather's back 40, bloated and wrong in the summer heat as darkness settled around us like a heavy blanket. Emma let out a gasp that made me jump. She was pointing at her camera's display, hands trembling. The patterns in her latest shots were glowing with a sickly greenish light that hadn't been visible to our naked eyes. But that wasn't what had startled her. In the corner of one image, barely visible in the growing darkness, was a hand reaching out of the mud. Not a human hand. The fingers were too long, too numerous, and the flesh appeared to be sloughing off the bone like candle wax. I grabbed Emma's arm and started pulling her back toward our trailer, my feet slipping in the increasingly unstable mud. That's when we heard it. A wet, sucking sound coming from the ground behind us. I told Emma not to look back, but we both knew she would. Her scream echoed through the trees as the mud began to rise, taking shape in ways that violated every natural law. We ran, but with each step, our feet left new patterns in the earth. And somewhere deep in my mind, I realized we weren't escaping. We were adding to whatever horrible thing we'd started. We spent that night huddled in our trailer, listening to the sounds of something moving through the darkness outside. The rain had started again, drumming against the metal roof in an irregular rhythm that seemed to form words just beyond my comprehension. Emma sat at our small dining table, obsessively reviewing the photos on her camera while I tried to get a signal on our satellite phone. The device was working perfectly, but every call disconnected after exactly 13 seconds of static. It wasn't until Emma played back one of those static recordings that we realized we could hear voices in the white noise, ancient guttural sounds that made my teeth ache. The morning brought no relief from our growing sense of dread. The mud around our trailer had dried despite the rain, hardening into a clay-like surface that preserved every symbol we'd inadvertently created. Emma, always the researcher, began sketching the patterns in her journal. Her hands moved across the paper with an unsettling urgency, and I noticed she was reproducing the symbols with perfect accuracy without even looking at her reference photos when I pointed this out. She stared at her hands as if seeing them for the first time, then ran to the bathroom to be violently ill. I should have burned that journal right then, but something stopped me. Something wanted those symbols preserved. It was around noon when we heard the first coherent whisper. It came from everywhere and nowhere, speaking in a language that we shouldn't have understood but somehow did. It told us about the old ones who had waited beneath the earth since before time had a name. It spoke of flesh and bone and transformation, of a ritual that had been waiting millennia for the right vessels to come along. With each word, the symbols around our trailer pulsed with that same sickly light we'd seen in the photographs. Emma began to translate the whispers into English, her voice taking on a hollow, echoing quality that made her sound like a different person entirely. The local ranger station was supposed to be just 5 miles north of our location. I convinced Emma we needed to drive there to get help or at least get away from whatever was happening around our campsite. She agreed, but her eyes had a glazed, distant look that I didn't like as I started the engine. She pressed her hand against the window, transfixed by something in the tree line. I followed her gaze and felt my reality tilt sideways. The trees were wrong. Their branches had begun to twist into the same patterns we'd been seeing in the mud, forming symbols against the gray sky. Nature itself was being rewritten around us. Our attempt to drive away turned into a nightmare of its own. Each turn of the wheels left new symbols in our wake, more complex and grotesque than before. Through the rearview mirror, I could see them starting to move moments after we created them, the mud rising up into shapes that my mind refused to fully process. Emma's translations of the whispers had become a constant stream now, speaking of a convergence, of the thinning of walls between worlds. She clutched her camera like a lifeline, documenting everything even as tears streamed down her face. The ranger station, we discovered, was no longer where it should have been. The road led us in circles, each loop bringing us back to our starting point. But the trailer had somehow become darker, older, as if it was aging years with each failed escape attempt. As the day wore on, we made a discovery that shattered what was left of our rational world. Emma found a book in our trailer that neither of us had packed. An ancient, leather-bound tome that looked like it had been grown rather than made. Its pages were filled with the same symbols we'd been creating, alongside illustrations that made me wish humans had never evolved the ability to draw. But it was the publication date that broke something inside my mind. It was dated 3 weeks in the future, and there, on page 73, was a photograph of Emma and me, standing beside our trailer in the rain. The caption beneath it was in English, "The chosen vessels begin their work." The photo hadn't been taken yet, but somehow I knew with terrifying certainty that it would be. The transformation began at sunset. I watched in horror as the mud beneath our trailer began to ripple and pulse like a living thing, the symbols we'd created glowing with an intensity that hurt my eyes. Emma had stopped translating the whispers hours ago. She didn't need to anymore. We both could hear them clearly now, their ancient voices singing hymns of flesh and rebirth. The first creature emerged from what had once been our tire tracks, pulling itself from the earth with hands that were too numerous, too fluid in their construction. Its flesh was like wet clay, constantly shifting and reforming, with multiple faces that emerged and submerged across its surface like swimmers in a dark pool. Our trailer had become our prison. We couldn't leave, not after what we'd seen happen to the forest around us. The trees had finished their transformation, their bark now resembling raw meat more than wood, their branches reaching down with finger-like appendages that grasped at anything that moved. The ancient book we'd found seemed to grow thicker with each passing hour, its pages filling with new photographs and text that documented our descent into this nightmare. What terrified me most was that some of these photos showed moments that hadn't happened yet, and with each one that came true, I felt our grip on reality slipping further away. Emma's camera had taken on a life of its own. It captured images without her touching it, each photo more disturbing than the last. They showed not just what was happening around us, but impossible angles of our own faces, twisted in expressions I knew we hadn't made yet. In one particularly haunting image, I saw myself standing outside the trailer, my skin covered in symbols that matched those in the mud. But what chilled me to my core was the date stamp on that photo. It was still 2 days in the future. Emma spent hours staring at these photos, her artistic eye seeing patterns and meanings that her mind couldn't, or wouldn't, share with me. The creatures multiplied as night fell, each one emerging from a different symbol we'd created during our failed escape attempts. They moved with a terrible purpose, arranging themselves in circles around our trailer, their flesh forms mimicking the patterns beneath them. The whispers had become a chorus, and to my horror, I realized I was beginning to understand not just their words, but their purpose. They spoke of a grand design, of how our arrival had been prophesied in texts written before mankind learned to speak. Our trailer wasn't just a vehicle anymore. It was a key, and every mile we'd driven had been part of a lock's mechanism. Turning slowly towards some terrible opening, I tried to destroy the symbols once. In a moment of desperate clarity, I took our emergency gas can and doused the nearest pattern, hoping to burn away whatever dark magic we'd unknowingly crafted. Emma screamed for me to stop, but I was beyond reason. The match fell, the gasoline ignited, but instead of destroying the symbol, the flames turned green and began to move against the wind, forming new patterns in the air. The fire spread in impossible geometric shapes, and from its heart emerged something that made the other creatures seem tame by comparison. After that, we accepted our role as observers to this horror, knowing intervention would only hasten whatever transformation was coming. The revelation about our trailer's true nature came through one of Emma's photographs, taken during a brief moment when the creatures had retreated to the tree line. The image showed our vehicle from above, an angle that should have been impossible to capture. In the photo, the trailer's metal skin had become transparent, revealing machinery that wasn't made of any earthly materials. Its true form was organic, alive, composed of the same shifting flesh as the creatures outside. We weren't driving the trailer. It had been driving us, following an ancient map written in a language of symbols that we'd been helplessly transcribing into the earth with every turn of its wheels. As this realization sank in, the walls around us began to pulse with a heartbeat that matched our own. And Emma's next photograph showed both of us with expressions of terrible understanding on our faces, expressions we were wearing at that exact moment. The truth revealed itself through Emma's bloodied nose as she flipped through the ancient book, her fingers leaving crimson marks on pages that seemed to drink in the red droplets eagerly. Each photograph she'd taken had found its way into the tome, arranging itself chronologically in a story that was still being written. But it was her blood that made the hidden text appear, words written between the lines in a shade of red that matched her own. They told us why we had been chosen, and the revelation made me wish for the ignorance of our earlier terror. We weren't random victims. We were catalysts, chosen before birth, our very DNA encoded with symbols that matched those we'd been unknowingly creating. Emma's photography career, my decision to buy this particular trailer, our attraction to each other, none of it had been our choice. We were engineered, crafted across generations by beings that had waited in the spaces between reality. Pulling genetic strings like master puppeteers, the whispers became louder as we read, no longer trying to hide their excitement. They spoke of bloodlines converging, of celestial alignments, and of a hunger that had waited eons to be satisfied. The creatures outside pressed against our trailer's windows, their flesh merging with the glass, creating viewing portals that showed impossible landscapes beyond, worlds where the laws of physics were more suggestions than rules. The ritual had begun the moment we first took this cursed trailer on the road. Every mile we drove, every turn we made, every stop for fuel or rest, all of it had been predetermined, creating a massive symbol across the landscape that only became visible when viewed from dimensions we couldn't comprehend. The creatures showed us this truth by temporarily lifting our consciousness above our physical forms. We saw the pattern we'd created across the state of Washington, a massive sigil drawn in diesel fumes and tire tracks, with our current location serving as its central point. The realization that we'd been completing this pattern for months made me vomit. But even that was part of the ritual, my bile forming smaller versions of the same symbols on the trailer's floor. Our very presence here was completing a circuit that had been left unfinished for millennia. Emma's photographs weren't just documenting the horrors, they were capturing the stages of a transformation that had already claimed us without our knowledge. When she showed me her latest series of images, I saw our faces changing across the timestamps, our features subtly shifting to match the fluid nature of the creatures outside. The whispers confirmed what we were seeing. We weren't meant to be sacrifices to these entities. We were meant to become them, our bodies serving as vessels for something that needed human form to complete its grand design. The trailer wasn't just a key, it was an incubator, preparing us for a metamorphosis that had already begun. In a moment of desperate clarity, I tried to remember how we'd ended up on this specific road, but my memories had become as fluid as the flesh of the creatures surrounding us. Each attempt to recall our journey revealed new layers of manipulation. The map we'd followed had changed every time we looked at it, the roads rearranging themselves to guide us here. Even our GPS had been compromised, its screen occasionally displaying those same ancient symbols between route recalculations. We hadn't chosen this path. It had chosen us, called us, pulled us inexorably toward this point where realities converged. The beings outside showed us glimpses of their own journeys across vast cosmic distances, searching for precisely the right vessels to complete their work. The most terrifying revelation came when Emma discovered she could now read the future pages of the book, pages that wrote themselves as she watched. They spoke of a convergence, a moment when the barrier between dimensions would become permeable enough for something to pass through. The creatures we'd seen were merely the heralds, the smallest fragments of what waited beyond. Our transformation wasn't just about us becoming them. It was about creating a permanent bridge between worlds. The symbols we'd created, the patterns we'd driven into the earth, even the changes in our own bodies. All of it was designed to anchor something vast and hungry to our reality. As this knowledge settled into our transformed minds, the walls of our trailer began to dissolve, and the creatures outside started to sing in voices that sounded terrifyingly like our own. Time had become meaningless as our transformation accelerated. The trailer's walls had completely dissolved into sheets of living tissue that pulsed with bioluminescent symbols, each beat sending waves of change through our bodies. Emma's camera had fused with her hands, her photographer's eye now literally that, a living lens that captured images from multiple dimensions simultaneously. I watched as her flesh shifted and flowed, revealing the true form that had always existed beneath her human shell. Yet somehow in this moment of ultimate horror, I found her more beautiful than ever. Perhaps because my own transformation had progressed to the point where I could finally see reality as it truly was. The book's final pages wrote themselves in our combined blood, revealing the ultimate purpose of our journey. We weren't just creating a bridge between worlds, we were healing an ancient wound in reality itself. The symbols we'd carved across Washington were sutures, stitching together a tear that had occurred when the old ones were first banished from our dimension. Our trailer had been a cocoon, preparing us for our role as the needle and thread of this cosmic surgery. The creatures that had emerged from our tire tracks were merely antibodies, preparing the site for the true healing that was about to begin. As this knowledge filled our transforming minds, We realized that our love for each other hadn't been engineered. It had been the one true thing that made us perfect for this role. The convergence began at midnight. Though such temporal measurements had become laughably inadequate, the symbols we'd created began to pull at the fabric of space-time, drawing together pieces of reality that had been separated since the beginning of existence. Through Emma's transformed eye, I watched as multiple dimensions overlapped at our location, creating a kaleidoscope of possible worlds. The beings we'd thought of as monsters showed us their true nature. They were surgeons, working to repair a cosmic wound that had been bleeding reality itself for eons. Our human forms had been necessary because only beings of matter could serve as anchors for the immense power being channeled through this convergence point. The final stage of our transformation coincided with the completion of the ritual. The flesh creatures surrounded us in concentric circles, their forms flowing together to create a living mandala of tissue and light. Emma and I stood at its center, our bodies now more symbol than substance. Our consciousness expanded to encompass multiple planes of existence simultaneously. Through her camera eye, we captured the moment when the walls between worlds became permeable, and the truth of our universe poured through. What we saw there defied description in human terms. A reality where flesh and spirit, matter and energy, past and future, were all one continuous flow of existence. The old ones hadn't been trying to invade our world. They had been trying to remind us that all worlds were one. As the ritual reached its climax, we understood our final role. Emma's photographs and my memories would become part of the book, creating a record that would call the next pair of chosen vessels when they were needed. For reality wasn't healed in a single moment. It required constant maintenance, a perpetual cycle of renewal and repair. The symbols we'd created would fade. The flesh creatures would return to their dimension, and our trailer would appear on some used car lot, waiting for the next chosen pair. Our consciousness would disperse across multiple realities, becoming part of the vast network of awareness that maintained the structure of existence itself. In our last moments of individual awareness, Emma took our final photograph, an image that would appear at the beginning of the book, waiting to guide the next vessels toward their transformation. The last thing I saw through human eyes was Emma's smile as our forms dissolved into pure symbol, our love transcending the boundaries of flesh to become part of the universal language of reality. The whispers that had terrified us now became our voice, calling across dimensions to maintain the delicate balance of existence. Our trailer had never been just a vehicle. It had been a seed, planted by forces beyond comprehension, waiting for the right moment to bloom into a flower of flesh and reality. And as our consciousness expanded to encompass all possible worlds, we realized that every campground, every forest road, every muddy trail could be hiding another seed, waiting for the next chosen pair to begin their own journey of transformation. The horror we'd experienced was merely the chrysalis stage of a beautiful and terrible metamorphosis that had been occurring since the beginning of time, and would continue until the end of all possible realities.